and welcome to the second week of our mini parish mission from St. Anthony's and St. Joseph's. As you can see, our theme for the second week is peace. You've probably heard this song on the radio at least once this year, and if not, I imagine you will. I heard the bells on Christmas Day, their old familiar carols play, and wild and sleet the words repeat of peace on earth, goodwill to men. And thought as now the day had come, the belfries of all Christendom had told so long the unbroken song of peace on earth, goodwill to men. And in despair I bowed my head. There is no peace on earth, I said, for hate is strong that mocks the song of peace on earth, goodwill to men. Then pealed the bells more loud and deep, God is not dead, nor doth he sleep. The wrong shall fail, the right prevail, with peace on earth, goodwill toward men. Whether you hear Bing Crosby or Frank Sinatra singing it, this carol is still immensely moving. It actually comes from a poem written in 1863 by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow during the Civil War. Some of the verses which don't appear in the classic recordings make that connection even clearer. Take this, for instance. Then from each black accursed mouth the cannon thundered in the south, and with this sound the carols drowned of peace on earth, goodwill toward men. Longfellow brilliantly juxtaposes the two sounds. The cannons of war bringing death and destruction, thundering their brazen sound. This overwhelms the ringing of the church bells, which are crying out for peace. We often see these two opposites paired together, peace and war, or if you like Tolstoy, War and Peace. Is peace, however, nothing more than the absence of war? Is peace only what we experience when there's not any fighting going on? Certainly warfare has been a constant throughout human history. And while it hasn't always occurred everywhere, it's never seemed to stop, no matter how advanced we become as a civilization. I think peace has to be something deeper than simply the absence of conflict. And this goes for individuals and families and small groups of people as much as it does for nation states. After all, if you've ever seen the TV show Everybody Loves Raymond, you've probably seen some episodes where everyone is sitting around the family table, glaring at each other. They might not be actively fighting, but could you really call that peace? We probably had that experience ourselves, when although people are quiet and not shouting at each other and actively brawling, it's not a very peaceful situation. How do we define peace as more than not war? We might ask ourselves, too, how is peace achieved? I think that's an important reflection for us during this Advent season. We know that we are called as Christians, in the Beatitudes, to be peacemakers, to seek always peaceful solutions, to be men and women of peace. So, what do we do to make that peace a reality? There are three things I can think of that we might try as avenues to peace. The first of these, order. The second, moderation. And the third, forgiveness. Now, in speaking about order, I don't simply mean that we should be law and order type people, although obeying laws and being orderly is important. Again, I mean something deeper. Something at the level of the individual soul. Something that's more than just following rules. St. Thomas Aquinas, one of our greatest theologians, described an order of love. It was a hierarchy in which we should love different people and things. St. Thomas said we should love God first and foremost, then others, ourselves, and then created things and realities. This has been popularized as in the saying, God first, others second, me third. Let's break that down in more detail. We should love God first and foremost. This has been the source of biblical faith since the time of the Israelites. When they heard the command in Deuteronomy, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. Therefore you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, all your mind, and all your strength." In the New Testament, Jesus maintains that as the first and greatest commandment, to love God with all your heart and all your soul and all your strength. And Jesus continues, the second is like it, to love your neighbor as yourself. Right there we see in Jesus' own words this same order: God, others, and me. If we see God as goodness itself and as the source of all goodness, then if we love him first and foremost above all things, it means we're aiming our lives at the right end. We're seeking what is best and most wholesome, most truthful, and most good in all of reality. And that has to be God. It's for this reason that we say everyone should seek to love God first. And we know as Christians this is our first duty. But some people might look a little sidelong at that and say, well, aren't I supposed to love my family, my friends? Shouldn't I love my country? This is where we get into the rest of the order of love, as Jesus would understand it and as St. Thomas explains it. To love God does not mean we love other people less. And loving God doesn't take anything away from the extent to which we can love our families and our friends. God is not competitive. He's not looking to be sure that we love him 100% and everybody else maybe 1 or 2%. Rather, he recognizes that our love for him extends to everything he has created. And so loving God doesn't take away from loving anybody else. Jesus tells us, second, to love others, the poor and needy, our own family and friends, to seek always to do good for our brothers and sisters. This is the impulse that leads us to Christian charity, which seeks to heal the hurts of the world by doing good, whether it's to give food and water and shelter and clothing to those most in need, whether it's to show kindness and encouragement to the people we meet in our lives who really need it, whether it's to show our love and our affection for those closest to us in our lives. All of these things are the ways in which we show love for others. The third in that order of love that I spoke about was to love ourselves. Now, I don't mean we have to be narcissistic about it. In fact, that's the exact opposite of what I mean. We should love ourselves because God loved us. That's why we're here. He created us and blesses us because he loves us. And that means in God's eyes, we're worthy of love. And we should love ourselves too, but not in a vain way. We should love ourselves rather as if we had responsibility for caring for ourselves. This is a notion that's been popularized in some popular students of psychology these days. But it's based on an ancient insight that all the church fathers would advert to. Our love for ourselves should proceed from the ways in which God loves us. But we shouldn't make ourselves number one. We shouldn't seek always to satisfy our own needs first and foremost. Rather, we have a duty to be sure that we live a good life. We have the right to ensure that our needs are met. But we don't have the right to run roughshod over other people and act as if the universe revolved around us. Because the secret is, it doesn't. After ourselves, it's appropriate for us to make use of created things and to enjoy them in a mode that's appropriate. We don't want to be the sort of people who love things and use others. We want to be the men and women who love others and can wisely use things. Whether it's your car, your computer, Whether it's enjoying the natural created beauty God has provided us with, whether it's showing affection for your cat or dog. All these things are appropriate in their proper measure. And if they follow in that same order I outlined in the beginning, God, others, myself, and things. When that right order is established in our lives, we find that we're well-integrated people, that we're keeping things in perspective, that we have our priorities straight. Now, if we loved things more than we did God, if we loved possessions more than we loved other people, you can probably guess the sort of people we would become. Miserly and greedy, selfish and preoccupied with our own needs, cold-hearted and manipulative. This is not the sort of thing that leads to peace. So I would say, in the first hand, if you want peace, work to achieve this order of love in your life, loving God with all your heart and mind and soul and strength, to love your neighbor as yourself, to love yourself as a child of God, and to enjoy and use the good things that God has provided for us. The second way to peace that I mentioned was moderation. And a lot of this follows from what I was saying about properly using things. We all have desires and wants, and a lot of those are based on our most basic needs. For food, shelter, clothing, love, and friendship, and these basic things that allow us to live as dignified human beings. We have a right to supply those needs. But seeking more than what is necessary, always going beyond and wanting more and better and more and better, we quickly find that we lose this moderation that I speak of. And we begin to resent those who have more than we do. You can see how easy this is, particularly in our society, which is so driven by consumer culture. When that person has the newest phone, suddenly we think, boy, it would be nice to have that. Hopefully that's as far as it goes. But sometimes when envy and resentment creep into our hearts, we find that we are angry at that other person for having something we want that we don't have. That envy can devolve into greed. And greed is always a source of conflict, because it seeks only what I want and what I think is good for me. Christian moderation, however, proceeds from the notion that, simply put, we can't take these things with us. And however good created things are, they shouldn't define our lives. If we allow our desires and wants to grow out of bounds, then we find that we become the sort of people who are just hoarding things in and not seeking the good of others, or even our own true good, which is God himself. Greed, envy, jealousy, anger, these things will always lead to conflict. Think of how many wars have been fought over natural resources, or symbolic things like the need for honor and glory and power. All of these proceed from a lack of moderation. Instead, perhaps we should hear the call of Christ again to moderate our desires and to recognize that God will bless us with what we need. If we seek first his kingdom, then all these good things will be added unto us. The final thing, I think, that we can work towards for peace is forgiveness. It's kind of an odd notion in the world today. You see how difficult it is for people to forgive. I mentioned it in my previous talk, but you can see on social media in what short supply forgiveness can be found. Whether people are being canceled for wrong deeds and bad words that they said, whether they simply held unpopular opinions. It's very easy to get a whole lot of people mad at you today. And often have we heard in political or cultural discourse, they shouldn't be forgiven. That's not how God works. And that's not how he wants us to work either. There is the great story in the gospel of the woman caught in adultery We know from the gospel that she was caught red-handed, so to speak, in the very act. And she's brought before Jesus as the crowd plans to stone her. But Jesus simply looks at her and says, "I forgive you." I'm paraphrasing there. We know how the gospel goes. He asks if there is anyone there who is without sin. And to their credit, the assembled crowd, in shame, lets their rocks fall and kind of sidles away, I'm sure embarrassed. They recognized that they aren't without their own sins. And when they've all let their rocks fall, and Jesus looks at that woman again, what she hears is, "There are none to condemn you, and neither do I condemn you." Think of what that attitude does. Jesus steps aside from a logic of retaliating and getting revenge and always being sure that the guilty get punished at every cost. He has no interest in the death of the sinner or their humiliation, but only their repentance, only their desire to recognize their faults, the ways in which they've gone wrong, and their desire to come back to him. That's the sort of spirit of forgiveness that should motivate us. We've all had people who've probably insulted us, hurt our feelings, maybe even physically harmed us in some way, shape, or form. And we know how upset and angry that can make us. Our immediate desire is often to get back at that person, to first let them know what they did wrong, and then to try and get our own back from them. Payback. Is it worth it, though? Because it never stops with payback. Instead, there always just seems to be this chain of wrong following wrong following wrong. It's for this reason that Jesus tells us to forgive not once or twice or even 7 times, but 70 times 7. Probably because he knows that we're going to need to forgive anew each day. You've had this experience yourselves, I know I have, where someone has upset us, and we think to ourselves, "I forgive them." We may even say, "I forgive you." And then an hour or a day or a week later, we think about that same incident again and start beating them up in our minds all over again. That's why we need to forgive more than once, because we're probably going to keep dredging up those past faults again and again. Each time that happens in your mind and heart, how would things be different instead if you forgave? Now, to take just a common everyday example, say you're driving down 17 here in the Binghamton area, and someone cuts you off. It's a rude thing to do, and it's a dangerous thing to do. Your temptation might be to lay on the horn, perhaps mutter some imprecation against them, shout, yell, use bad language, maybe even speed up a bit yourself. None of these things fix the problem. None of them are going to make that individual any more polite or considerate. And now, because of our anger that we're feeling at that person, we ourselves are putting other drivers in danger. What if instead, in those circumstances, we reminded ourselves to forgive? And that once we've ascertained that we're safe and secure, that we just let that person go with a prayer for their safety and for their reconciliation. Forgiveness, moderation, and order. These things in our lives can all lead to peace. But here's perhaps the point I want to stress most in this brief talk to you today. Peace isn't just something we achieve by doing the right things. We're certainly called to work for peace and to be as peaceful as we can be. But ultimately, peace and harmony, concord, these are the gifts of God, and indeed the gifts of Jesus, the Prince of Peace. This Advent season, as we meditate on this great theme of peace, we have to be willing to let the Prince of Peace come to dwell in our hearts. After his resurrection, when Jesus greets the disciples in the upper room in Jerusalem, the words he says are this: "Peace be with you." those are the words he always says to his church as well. And they're not just empty words or a simple greeting like hello. They're an earnest wish from Jesus Christ that the peace which comes from loving him can come to dwell richly in our hearts. We're told in John's Gospel that just before the Last Supper, Jesus prays on behalf of his disciples and says, "Peace be with you. My peace is my gift to you. Not as the world gives, do I give this peace." The peace of Christ is something which far surpasses any uneasy treaty or alliance, any temporary ceasefire, and any state of mutual distrust that only lacks outward fighting. The peace of Christ, which he wants to pour into our hearts, is something that cannot be disturbed or destroyed. Perhaps one of the most famous images of what this peace looks like comes from the book of Daniel. Daniel, the young prophet, in the lion's den. When the Persian king had thrown him in to execute him, Daniel, who was so suffused and so on fire with the peace that God gives, is not afraid in the least. Instead, he recognizes that God will deliver him. And in fact, the lions treat him like house cats. That's the great things that can be done in a soul in which the peace of God has come to dwell. That is the peace which Christ wants to give to you this Advent season. I can only think of the great words of Luke's Gospel now, the hymn of the angels which they sing at the birth of Christ. And perhaps it's these words that are best to conclude on today. Glory to God in the highest, and on earth peace, goodwill toward men. God bless.